Take my jacket, Margaret. The sentence would echo in her memory for the rest of her life. But on that freezing afternoon in the winter of 1945, it sounded less like kindness and more like the beginning of something she could not yet understand. Snow drifted across the open yard of the temporary British holding camp somewhere in northern Germany, the wind pushing fine white powder across frozen ground that had already been stamped flat by hundreds of tired boots. The air smelled of wet wool, cold iron, and distant smoke from chimneys in a nearby village that had somehow survived the war. Margaret Adler stood in a long, silent line of German female prisoners, her shoulders hunched, her thin gray coat doing almost nothing to stop the wind that cut straight through the fabric. She was 22 years old, though most of the guards who glanced her way would have guessed younger. Months of rationing and the long collapse of the war had left her barely 90 pounds, her cheeks hollow, her hands red from cold. She had once been a schoolteacher in a small town outside Leipzig, the kind of teacher who kept chalk dust on her sleeves and pressed wildflowers into the pages of her grammar books for her students. That life now felt like something from another century. Around her, the other women stood quietly, their breath rising in thin white clouds. No one spoke much anymore. They had all heard the same stories before the surrender, the warnings repeated over and over by radio and officials and neighbors who believed them completely. The British soldiers were supposed to hate them. The prisoners whispered that the guards would be harsh, that humiliation was inevitable, that mercy would be rare. So the women kept their eyes low and their expectations even lower. Every sound in the yard seemed amplified by the cold. The crunch of boots on frost, the rattle of a metal gate somewhere behind them, the low murmur of English voices carried by the wind. Margaret tried to stay on her feet, shifting her weight from one numb boot to the other, but the cold had settled deep into her bones during the long march that morning. She had walked nearly 5 miles through slushy roads and broken countryside, the sky the color of dull steel above them. At first, she thought the dizziness was just exhaustion. Then the ground tilted slightly beneath her. She blinked hard and tried to steady herself. For a moment, the line of women in front of her blurred together like figures in fog. A British officer standing several yards away noticed the small movement. Major James Whittaker had been watching the prisoners with the quiet patience of someone used to long days and difficult orders. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark wool coat heavy against the winter wind. He had seen the same exhaustion many times before. Without raising his voice, he stepped forward across the icy ground. His boots made a steady crunch with every step. The line of prisoners stiffened as he approached, some lowering their heads even further, others staring straight ahead, as if pretending not to exist. Margaret felt the world sway again and instinctively wrapped her arms tighter around herself. When the officer finally stopped in front of her, the wind lifted the edge of his coat for a moment. Then, without a word at first, he reached up, unfastened the thick wool jacket from his shoulders, and held it out toward her. The women in the line froze. No one moved. Even the guards nearby seemed to pause. The officer looked directly at the young German prisoner whose hands were shaking from cold and said in a calm, steady voice, "Take my jacket, Margaret." Margaret did not move at first because the offer made no sense in the world she thought she understood. Her mind searched for the hidden meaning behind the gesture the way a person searches the sky for clouds before a storm. The women beside her remained perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the frozen ground, as if looking up might somehow bring trouble. The British officer continued to hold the heavy jacket in front of her, the dark wool shifting slightly in the cold wind. It looked impossibly warm compared to the thin gray coat wrapped around her shoulders. Margaret hesitated, her fingers trembling not only from the cold, but from uncertainty. For years, she had heard the same message repeated everywhere from the radio to the classrooms to the streets of her hometown. The enemy would show no mercy. The enemy would treat prisoners with contempt. The enemy would never look at them as human beings. Yet the man standing in front of her did not look angry. His expression was calm, almost patient, as if he were simply waiting for someone to accept a perfectly ordinary kindness. The silence stretched across the yard long enough that even the wind seemed to slow. Finally, Margaret lifted her eyes for the first time and met the officer's gaze. His face carried the tired lines of someone who had spent too many winters in uniform, but there was nothing threatening in his posture. He simply nodded once, encouraging her to take the coat. Slowly she reached forward with stiff hands and touched the thick fabric. It was heavier than she expected, still warm from the officer's body heat. When she pulled it around her shoulders, the warmth spread through her arms almost instantly, and the sudden contrast made her realize just how cold she had been. A quiet murmur passed through the line of prisoners behind her. Some of the women exchanged brief glances of disbelief before quickly looking away again. Acts of kindness were rare enough in wartime that even a small one could feel almost shocking. Major James Whittaker stepped back after she secured the coat, as if the moment required no further explanation. One of the nearby British soldiers approached, carrying a metal cup that released thin curls of steam into the air. The soldier handed the cup to Margaret with a simple nod. Inside was hot tea, the dark liquid gently sloshing as her hands shook around the metal rim. She had not held something warm in days. The heat from the cup traveled through her palms and into her arms, steadying her breathing. Around them, the camp continued its slow rhythm of winter activity. Guards checked lists, gates creaked open and shut, and distant voices drifted across the yard in calm English accents. Yet for Margaret, the world felt strangely different now, as if a small crack had appeared in the wall of certainty she had built during the war. She had expected anger from the soldiers guarding them. Instead, she had received warmth from a man who did not even know her story. As the line of prisoners slowly began to move again toward the registration building at the far end of the yard, Margaret walked with the heavy jacket wrapped around her shoulders and the metal cup warming her hands, wondering why a stranger from the other side of the war had chosen that moment to treat her not as an enemy, but simply as a person. The line moved slowly toward the long wooden building that served as the registration office, and each step made the snow crunch softly beneath Margaret's worn boots, while the heavy wool jacket rested across her shoulders like something she still was not certain she was allowed to keep. The warmth had begun to spread through her body, but the greater change was happening quietly inside her thoughts. For months, she had lived inside a world built from certainty. She had been told who the enemy was, how they would behave, and what fate awaited anyone who fell into their hands. Yet nothing in the prison yard had followed the script she expected. The British guards walked calmly beside the line of prisoners without shouting. Their voices were low and measured when they spoke to one another, and more than once Margaret noticed a soldier step aside to help an older woman keep her balance on the icy ground. None of it looked like the scenes she had imagined during the long final months of the war. When the line reached the doorway of the building, the warm air inside drifted outward and mixed with the sharp winter cold. Margaret stepped through the entrance and immediately noticed the smell of paper, coffee, and damp wool coats. A long wooden table stretched across the room, where several British clerks sat writing names onto official forms. Lamps cast a steady yellow light over stacks of documents, while a small iron stove in the corner radiated heat that made the room feel almost comfortable. One by one, the prisoners stepped forward to give their names, their towns, and their dates of birth. When Margaret's turn arrived, she set the empty metal cup on the edge of the table and quietly said her full name. The clerk looked up briefly, his pencil paused in midair, then wrote the information carefully across the page in neat English handwriting. He asked a few more questions in a calm voice and marked several boxes before sliding the paper aside. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it felt strangely formal and orderly, nothing like the chaos she had feared. As she stepped away from the table, she noticed Major James Whittaker standing near the doorway speaking with another officer. His posture was relaxed, one gloved hand resting lightly against the wooden frame as he listened. For a moment, Margaret wondered if he even remembered the brief moment in the yard when he had offered the jacket. To him, it might have been nothing more than a simple decision made in passing. But to her, it had already begun to shift something deeper. She tightened the jacket around her shoulders and moved toward the far side of the room, where the other women waited quietly on wooden benches. Through the frost-covered window, she could see the gray winter sky stretching across the camp and the slow movement of soldiers continuing their routine duties outside. The war had ended only weeks earlier, and the world still felt uncertain and fragile, like a landscape after a long storm. Yet as Margaret sat there holding the warmth of the borrowed coat, she could not stop wondering about the quiet British officer who had stepped forward in the snow without anger and without hesitation, because something in that simple act suggested that the story she had been told about enemies and strangers might not be the whole truth after all. The wooden bench creaked softly as Margaret shifted her weight. The heavy wool jacket still wrapped around her shoulders while the quiet room filled with the low sounds of pencils scratching across paper and boots moving across the wooden floor. Around her the other women sat with their hands folded in their laps, each of them carrying the same cautious expression that comes from weeks of uncertainty. No one spoke loudly. Conversations drifted only in whispers, as if everyone feared disturbing the strange calm that had settled over the camp. Margaret held her hands close together, letting the warmth from the stove slowly reach her fingers, and for the first time in many days, she felt the tight pressure in her chest begin to loosen. Through the window, she could still see soldiers walking along the snowy paths outside, their dark uniforms moving steadily between the rows of buildings. Everything appeared organized, deliberate, almost routine. The war had been chaos for so long that the quiet order of the camp felt unfamiliar. After several minutes the door opened again, and a young British corporal stepped inside, carrying a small crate. He placed it carefully on a table near the benches and began handing out thick slices of bread wrapped in paper. When he reached Margaret, he paused briefly, offering the bread with a polite nod before moving to the next woman. The simple gesture felt almost unreal. Food had become something uncertain during the last months of the war, yet here it was given without argument or suspicion. Margaret held the bread in both hands, feeling its weight as if confirming that it truly existed. As she ate slowly, she noticed movement near the doorway again. Major James Whittaker had stepped back inside the building, brushing a thin layer of snow from his gloves before speaking quietly with one of the clerks. His voice was low and calm, the tone of someone accustomed to responsibility, yet uninterested in displaying authority. Margaret watched him for only a moment before lowering her eyes again. She did not want to appear ungrateful or curious, yet she could not deny that the earlier moment in the snow had left a lasting impression. After finishing his brief conversation, the officer turned toward the benches where the prisoners waited. His gaze passed across the room until it paused briefly on Margaret. There was no sign of surprise in his expression, only a small acknowledging nod, as if he were simply confirming that she was warm enough now. Then he stepped outside again, and the door closed behind him with a soft thud. The room returned to its quiet rhythm, but something subtle had changed inside Margaret's thoughts. The jacket resting around her shoulders was still warm, carrying the faint scent of cold air and wool. It felt less like a borrowed item and more like a quiet reminder that the world could still contain unexpected kindness even after years of conflict. As the afternoon light faded slowly across the frosted window, and the clerks continued their careful work, Margaret sat quietly among the other women, wondering how many other stories inside this camp might unfold in ways no one had expected. The afternoon passed slowly inside the wooden building while the last groups of prisoners finished their registration, and by the time the clerks closed their notebooks, the gray winter light outside had already begun to fade into evening. Margaret remained seated quietly with the others, the heavy jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the quiet rhythm of the room as soldiers moved through the doorway and distant footsteps crossed the snow outside. Every sound felt clearer now that the tension of the long march had faded. The warmth from the stove reached farther across the floor, and the simple bread she had eaten earlier settled gently in her stomach, bringing a calm she had almost forgotten could exist during wartime. After a while the door opened again, and a senior sergeant stepped inside, holding a clipboard. His voice carried a steady British accent as he began reading several names, directing small groups of prisoners toward the barracks where they would spend the night. One by one the women stood and followed the instructions without protest. The process was orderly and calm, nothing like the confusion Margaret had imagined when she first realized she had become a prisoner. When her name was finally called, she rose slowly from the bench, adjusting the large jacket around her shoulders before joining the small group, heading toward the door. Outside, the cold air greeted them again, sharper now as evening settled across the camp. Lanterns had been lit along the main path, their soft yellow glow reflecting off the snow and creating long shadows across the ground. The guards walked beside the group at an easy pace, their boots pressing steady patterns into the snow as they guided the women toward a row of low wooden barracks near the far fence. As Margaret walked, she noticed the quiet discipline of the soldiers around them. No one rushed the prisoners or raised their voice. A few soldiers spoke quietly among themselves about ordinary things, the tone of their conversation almost casual, as if the war that had shaped their lives for so long was finally beginning to loosen its hold. The barracks door opened with a wooden creak, and warm air drifted outward from inside. Simple rows of bunk beds filled the room, each one covered with clean gray blankets folded neatly at the corners. A small stove burned near the center, and the soft crackle of wood created a sound that reminded Margaret of winter evenings from years before the war began. The women stepped inside slowly, taking in the sight with cautious relief. It was not home, but it was shelter. As Margaret moved toward one of the empty bunks, she paused for a moment, glancing back through the open doorway. In the distance, she could see a familiar figure standing near the path beneath a lantern. Major James Whitaker stood speaking with another officer, the soft light outlining the calm posture she had already come to recognize. He looked toward the barracks briefly, perhaps only checking that the prisoners had reached their shelter safely. For a second his gaze passed across the doorway where Margaret stood. There was no dramatic gesture, only a quiet nod of acknowledgement before he returned to his conversation. Margaret stepped inside and sat on the lower bunk, pulling the heavy jacket more tightly around her shoulders as the door closed behind her. The camp settled gradually into the stillness of evening, and as the fire in the stove crackled softly nearby, she realized that the simple kindness she had experienced earlier that day had begun to reshape the way she looked at the uncertain days ahead. The barracks grew quieter as evening settled across the camp, and the soft glow from the small stove painted slow shadows across the wooden walls while the women arranged themselves along the rows of bunks. Margaret remained seated on the lower bed for a long moment, her hands resting on the thick wool sleeves of the jacket that still felt unfamiliar around her shoulders. The warmth it provided was steady and real, yet her thoughts kept returning to the quiet moment in the snow earlier that day. War had taught her to expect sharp voices, suspicion, and distance from the people on the other side of the conflict. Instead, she had been given a coat and a cup of hot tea by a man who did not even ask for thanks. The memory settled in her mind like a small stone dropped into still water, sending slow circles outward through everything she believed she understood about enemies. Around her, the other women spoke softly, their voices low as they shared brief stories of the long journey that had brought them here. Some wondered how long they would remain in the camp. Others spoke about the towns they had left behind and the uncertain future waiting somewhere beyond the fences. Margaret listened quietly, without adding much of her own voice to the conversation. She had always been someone who observed more than she spoke, someone who noticed the small details others overlooked. The crackling of the stove, the quiet creak of wooden boards beneath careful footsteps, the distant murmur of British soldiers changing shifts outside the barracks door. These sounds blended together into a calm rhythm that slowly replaced the tension that had lived in her chest for weeks. After some time, a guard opened the door briefly to place a lantern near the entrance, its warm light spreading across the room before the door closed again. Through the narrow window above the bunks, Margaret could see the night sky forming over the camp, a deep winter blue stretching above the rows of buildings and watchtowers. Snow continued to fall lightly, covering the ground with a fresh, quiet layer that softened every shape and sound. She leaned back against the wooden wall and allowed herself to breathe slowly, feeling the warmth of the jacket settle deeper around her shoulders. The fabric carried the faint scent of cold air and leather gloves, reminders of the officer who had given it without hesitation. Margaret realized she did not even know why he had chosen her in that moment. There had been many prisoners in the line, many women just as cold and exhausted. Yet he had stepped forward as if something simple and human mattered more than the lines that war had drawn between them. The thought stayed with her as the room grew dimmer and the quiet conversations faded into sleep. Outside the barracks, a lantern swayed gently in the winter wind, while soldiers continued their calm patrol through the snow-covered paths of the camp. Somewhere among them walked the British officer whose simple act had begun to reshape the way one German prisoner saw the world. Margaret closed her eyes slowly, still wrapped in the borrowed warmth, wondering if the next morning might reveal more moments that challenged the harsh expectations the war had carved into everyone's hearts. Morning arrived quietly over the camp as a pale winter light slowly filtered through the narrow windows of the barracks, touching the wooden floor and the rows of bunks where the prisoners had slept through the cold night. Margaret opened her eyes to the soft sound of footsteps outside and the faint clatter of metal cups being stacked somewhere beyond the door. For a moment she remained still, listening as the camp around her came gradually to life. The stove in the center of the room still held a small bed of glowing embers, and the warmth from the heavy jacket wrapped around her shoulders had stayed with her through the night. She sat up slowly, drawing the wool closer around her arms while the other women began stirring from sleep. Quiet voices rose across the room as blankets were folded and boots touched the floor. The air inside the barracks carried the familiar scent of wood smoke and cold winter air slipping through the cracks in the walls. When the door finally opened, a British guard stepped inside and spoke in a calm voice, explaining that breakfast was being served in the dining hall across the yard. His tone was polite and steady, nothing like the harsh commands Margaret had once expected from soldiers guarding prisoners. The women formed a small line and stepped outside together, the fresh morning air bright and sharp as it filled their lungs. Snow covered the ground in a smooth white layer that reflected the pale sunlight across the camp. Margaret walked quietly among the group, the borrowed jacket protecting her from the cold wind that drifted between the buildings. As they crossed the open yard, she noticed soldiers already moving through their routines, some carrying crates of supplies, while others checked lists near the gates. The entire place functioned with a calm order that still felt unfamiliar after years of war. Near the dining hall, a small line of soldiers waited with steaming metal containers placed on long wooden tables. One by one, the prisoners were handed cups of warm oatmeal and slices of bread. Margaret accepted the food with a quiet nod and stepped aside, feeling the heat of the cups spread through her fingers once again. While she ate slowly, she noticed a familiar figure walking along the path beyond the tables. Major James Whitaker moved through the yard, speaking briefly with several soldiers, his posture relaxed yet attentive as he listened to their reports. The morning light reflected softly against the snow around him, and for a moment he paused near the dining area, scanning the line of prisoners with the quiet focus of someone ensuring that everything was running as it should. His gaze passed across Margaret again, and just as it had the evening before, he offered a small nod of acknowledgement before continuing along the path. The gesture lasted only a second, yet it carried the same calm certainty as before. Margaret lowered her eyes to the cup in her hands, feeling a quiet realization settle inside her thoughts. The war had taught everyone to see enemies in simple terms, but moments like these suggested that people were far more complicated than the stories nations told about one another. As the morning activity continued around the camp, and the prisoners finished their breakfast beneath the pale winter sky, Margaret stood quietly with the warmth of the jacket around her shoulders and the steady rhythm of the camp unfolding before her, sensing that the small act of kindness she had received might be only the beginning of something she did not yet fully understand. After breakfast, the prisoners were guided back across the yard toward the barracks, but the rhythm of the camp had already begun to shift into the quiet routine of a new day. Margaret walked slowly with the others, her boots pressing shallow marks into the fresh snow while the borrowed jacket shielded her from the sharp wind moving between the buildings. The sky above the camp had cleared during the morning, revealing a pale winter sun that reflected across the white ground and made the entire yard appear brighter than it had the day before. Soldiers moved through their tasks with calm precision, some carrying wooden crates while others checked the fences and spoke quietly near the guard posts. Everything about the place suggested order and patience rather than hostility. As the group approached the barracks, a British corporal stopped them briefly and explained that several prisoners would be assigned light duties during the day to help keep the camp running smoothly. His voice remained steady and respectful as he described the tasks, which included helping in the kitchen, sweeping the walkways, and organizing supplies inside one of the storage buildings. The work sounded simple, yet Margaret sensed that the structure of these routines was important. After years of uncertainty, the steady rhythm of daily responsibilities seemed designed to restore a small sense of normal life for everyone inside the camp. When the corporal finished reading the list of names, Margaret heard her own name among those assigned to assist in the kitchen. She stepped forward quietly along with several other women and followed the soldier across the yard toward a low brick building near the dining hall. Warm air escaped through the doorway as they entered, carrying the comforting smell of fresh bread and simmering soup. Inside, a few British cooks were already moving between large metal pots and wooden counters, their sleeves rolled up as they prepared the midday meal. One of the cooks looked up and offered a brief smile, before pointing toward a stack of clean bowls that needed to be arranged along the serving tables. Margaret moved to the task without hesitation, lifting the bowls carefully and placing them in neat rows across the wooden surface. The work was simple but steady, and the warmth of the kitchen quickly pushed away the lingering cold from outside. While she worked, she noticed the open window above the counter where the winter sunlight slipped through, casting long bright lines across the floor. From that window, she could see the path that ran between the kitchen and the main yard of the camp. A few minutes later, a familiar figure appeared along that path. Major James Whittaker walked past the building speaking with another officer, the two men moving at an unhurried pace as they reviewed a small notebook together. Margaret did not expect him to look inside the kitchen, yet as he passed the window his gaze lifted briefly and paused. For a moment their eyes met through the glass and the sunlight reflecting across the snow. There was no surprise in his expression, only the same calm recognition she had seen before. He gave a slight nod and continued walking along the path as if the moment required no further attention. Margaret returned to arranging the bowls, but the quiet exchange remained in her thoughts. In the middle of a place defined by fences and uniforms, the simple rhythm of work and the quiet respect between strangers began to create something unexpected, a fragile sense that even after years of division, people might still choose to treat one another with dignity. The hours in the kitchen passed with a steady rhythm that felt almost peaceful compared to the uncertainty that had filled the previous weeks of Margaret's life. Steam rose slowly from the large metal pots while the cooks moved from counter to stove with quiet efficiency, their voices calm as they discussed the timing of the midday meal. Margaret continued arranging bowls and carrying stacks of bread from one table to another, the simple work allowing her thoughts to settle into a quiet focus. The warmth inside the kitchen wrapped around her like another layer beneath the heavy jacket she still wore, and every so often she caught the faint scent of flour and fresh soup drifting through the air. It reminded her of small village kitchens from before the war, places where the world had once felt predictable and safe. As the morning moved toward midday, the kitchen became busier. Soldiers stepped inside carrying crates of vegetables, while others prepared the long serving tables where the prisoners and guards would receive their food. Margaret noticed something unusual about the way the camp operated. There was no sharp division between the people preparing the meals and those who would later stand in line to receive them. The work simply continued with quiet cooperation, as if everyone understood that maintaining order required small efforts from many different hands. One of the cooks showed Margaret how to stack the bread more evenly along the trays so that each portion would be the same size. His instructions were brief and respectful, spoken with the tone of someone teaching a simple task rather than commanding a prisoner. Margaret followed the guidance carefully, grateful for the clarity of the routine. After some time, she stepped toward the open window again to place an empty crate outside. The cold air brushed lightly across her face, carrying with it the distant sounds of the camp. Soldiers moved along the paths, their boots crunching softly in the snow, while voices drifted across the yard in relaxed conversation. The scene felt almost ordinary, a quiet community continuing its daily work beneath the winter sky. As she leaned slightly toward the window, she noticed movement near the path that passed the kitchen. Major James Whittaker had returned once again, this time walking alone with a folded document in one hand. He paused briefly near the doorway of the dining hall, as if reviewing the notes before slipping them into the pocket of his coat. For a moment he looked toward the kitchen window, perhaps drawn by the activity inside. When he saw Margaret standing there, his expression carried the same calm recognition as before. He raised one hand slightly in a small gesture of greeting, simple and respectful, before continuing along the path toward another group of soldiers waiting near the far building. Margaret stood still for a moment after he passed, the quiet gesture settling in her thoughts. It was such a small exchange that no one else in the busy kitchen even noticed it, yet it carried a quiet significance she could not easily explain. The war had built walls of suspicion between strangers, But here inside this camp, those walls seemed to weaken little by little through simple acts that required no speeches and no grand explanations. As Margaret returned to the tables and continued arranging the trays of bread, she felt the steady rhythm of the work guiding her through the day, while somewhere beyond the kitchen walls the quiet officer, who had first stepped forward in the snow, continued moving through the camp with the same calm sense of responsibility that had already begun to change the way she looked at everything around her. By midday, the kitchen had filled with the steady movement of preparation as the final trays of bread were arranged, and the large metal pots of soup were carried carefully toward the serving tables. The cooks worked with quiet efficiency, while the prisoners assigned to kitchen duty completed the last small tasks before the meal began. Margaret wiped her hands on a clean cloth and stepped slightly back from the counter, observing the calm order that had formed inside the room. The warmth from the stove mixed with the scent of fresh bread and vegetables, creating an atmosphere that felt almost like an ordinary kitchen far from the memories of war. Outside the window, the winter sunlight rested gently across the snow-covered yard, and lines of soldiers and prisoners slowly began forming near the dining hall. The midday meal was about to begin. A cook near the doorway nodded toward Margaret and the other women who had been helping. His voice carried a tone of quiet appreciation as he told them they could step outside and join the line for food. Margaret moved toward the door and pushed it open, feeling the cool air brush against her face again after the long hours inside. The camp yard had grown livelier than it had been earlier in the morning. Soldiers walked between the buildings carrying small crates or speaking in calm conversation, while prisoners gathered in an orderly line along the path. No one rushed the process. The entire scene moved with a slow rhythm that suggested patience rather than urgency. Margaret joined the line quietly, the familiar weight of the jacket still around her shoulders as she waited with the others. The metal containers of soup released soft clouds of steam into the cold air, while soldiers filled bowls one at a time. When her turn came, she stepped forward and accepted the warm bowl with both hands, nodding in quiet thanks before moving aside to make space for the next person. She stood near the edge of the yard where a wooden fence ran along the boundary of the camp. From there she could see across the entire open space, including the path where officers often walked while overseeing the daily routines. As she lifted the spoon toward the warm soup, she noticed a familiar figure approaching from the far side of the yard. Major James Whitaker walked along the path with his hands resting lightly in the pockets of his coat, his pace unhurried as he observed the activity around the dining hall. The sunlight reflected across the snow behind him, outlining his calm posture as he moved between small groups of soldiers who paused briefly to speak with him. When he reached the area near the food line, he slowed slightly, his attention shifting across the prisoners gathered there. For a brief moment his gaze found Margaret again. He did not interrupt the line or step forward in any dramatic way. Instead, he simply inclined his head in a quiet gesture that carried the same steady respect she had seen since the first moment in the snow. Then he continued along the path, speaking with a nearby soldier before disappearing behind the corner of the dining hall. Margaret remained standing near the fence with the bowl of soup warming her hands. The steam rose slowly into the cold afternoon air while the sounds of the camp continued around her. Soldiers spoke in calm voices. Boots pressed softly into the snow. Somewhere a door closed, and a distant laugh carried briefly across the yard. In the middle of this quiet routine, Margaret realized that something inside her had changed in ways she had not expected. The war had drawn clear lines between sides and uniforms. Yet here in this place those lines seemed to soften with each small moment of dignity shared between strangers. And as she finished the last spoonful of soup beneath the pale winter sun, she sensed that the quiet officer who had first offered his jacket might be part of a larger story still unfolding inside the fences of the camp. The afternoon continued with the same calm rhythm that had slowly settled over the camp, and after the midday meal the prisoners were guided back toward their assigned duties or resting areas, while the pale winter sun moved gradually across the sky. Margaret returned to the kitchen, building along with the small group who had been helping earlier, the familiar warmth of the borrowed jacket still protecting her from the cold air that drifted through the yard. Inside the kitchen, the cooks had already begun cleaning the large pots and stacking the metal bowls used during the meal. The atmosphere felt relaxed, almost reflective, as if everyone understood that the simple routines of the day were part of rebuilding something steady after years of uncertainty. Margaret moved quietly between the tables, gathering empty trays and carrying them to a wooden counter near the sink. The task was simple and repetitive, yet there was a certain comfort in its predictability. Each tray stacked neatly beside the next, each bowl rinsed and placed carefully in its place. Outside the open window, she could see the soft afternoon light stretching across the snow-covered yard where soldiers continued their quiet patrols along the paths between the buildings. Occasionally, a distant voice carried through the cold air, followed by the muted sound of boots crossing the frozen ground. After some time, one of the cooks stepped beside Margaret and asked her to carry a small crate of clean cloths to the storage room near the rear of the building. She nodded and lifted the crate carefully, walking through a narrow hallway toward the back door. When she stepped outside again, the yard behind the kitchen was almost empty, the afternoon sun now lower in the sky and casting long shadows across the snow. A narrow path led toward a smaller wooden building used for supplies, and Margaret followed it quietly while holding the crate against her coat. As she approached the door of the storage building, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned slightly and saw Major James Whitaker walking along the same path from the direction of the dining hall. For the first time since she had arrived at the camp, there was no crowd of soldiers or prisoners around them. The yard was calm and still, the snow reflecting the soft golden light of late afternoon. The officer slowed his pace as he approached, his expression calm and thoughtful as always. When he reached a respectful distance, he paused, his eyes briefly resting on the heavy jacket around her shoulders. A faint, almost amused warmth appeared in his expression, as if he was quietly pleased to see that the coat had been useful. Margaret shifted the crate slightly in her arms, uncertain whether to speak or simply step aside. Before she could decide, the officer gave a small nod of greeting and spoke in a calm voice that carried none of the distance she had once expected from a man in uniform. He asked gently if the jacket had kept her warm through the cold night. The question was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried a tone of genuine concern that surprised her. For a brief moment, Margaret found herself searching for the right English words she had learned years earlier in school. Then she answered quietly that it had helped more than he could know. The officer listened without interruption and nodded once more, his calm expression unchanged. The exchange lasted only a few seconds before he stepped aside to allow her to continue toward the storage building. Yet as Margaret walked the remaining steps along the snowy path, she felt that the quiet conversation had shifted something deeper than a simple act of courtesy. In the middle of a place defined by uniforms and fences, two strangers from opposite sides of a long war had shared a moment of ordinary humanity, and the significance of that moment seemed to grow quietly with each passing hour. Margaret placed the crate of clean cloths inside the storage room and stood for a moment beside the wooden shelves, listening to the quiet stillness that filled the small building. Outside the narrow window, the winter afternoon had begun to fade, and the pale sunlight that had covered the camp earlier was slowly turning into the softer gray of approaching evening. The brief conversation with Major Whitaker remained fresh in her thoughts. His voice had been calm and simple, without the distance she had expected from an officer speaking to a prisoner. The question about the jacket had sounded almost like something one neighbor might ask another on a cold morning. Margaret closed the storage room door and stepped back onto the snowy path, pulling the jacket a little closer around her shoulders as the colder air returned. The camp behind the kitchen was quiet now, with only a few soldiers moving between the buildings as the day's duties gradually came to an end. The long shadows of the barracks stretched across the snow while lanterns were beginning to glow softly along the main paths. Margaret walked slowly back toward the kitchen building, the crunch of her boots breaking the silence with each careful step. Inside, the cooks had nearly finished their work for the day. One of them nodded politely as she returned, pointing toward a stack of wooden trays that needed to be carried to the dining hall before evening meal preparations began. Margaret lifted the trays and carried them carefully across the short path between the buildings. The dining hall was quieter now, with only a few soldiers arranging the long tables beneath the hanging lamps. The warm yellow light inside the hall created a calm atmosphere that felt very different from the tense places Margaret had imagined when she first thought about being taken prisoner. She set the trays neatly on the counter and paused near one of the windows. Outside, she could see the main yard of the camp slowly settling into evening. Groups of prisoners walked calmly back toward their barracks while soldiers spoke quietly beside the gates and watch posts. In the distance, she noticed Major Whitaker again, standing near the lantern along the central path while reviewing a small document with another officer. The two men spoke for a moment before the other officer walked away, leaving Whitaker standing alone beneath the light. For a brief second his gaze lifted toward the dining hall window, and even from that distance Margaret felt the quiet recognition in his expression. There was no need for another conversation. The small nod he gave carried the same steady respect she had come to recognize throughout the day. Margaret lowered her eyes slightly and returned to the task of arranging the trays along the serving table. The simple work felt familiar now, almost grounding. As evening deepened across the camp and the first stars began to appear above the darkening sky, she realized that the events of the past day had begun to reshape something inside her understanding of the world. The war had filled so many minds with rigid ideas about enemies and sides, yet the quiet moments she had experienced here suggested that those ideas were not always as solid as they seemed. Sometimes it took only a small act of kindness, offered without ceremony in the middle of a snowy prison yard, to begin revealing a different truth about people on both sides of a long and painful conflict. Evening settled gently across the camp as the last light of day faded beyond the snow-covered fields surrounding the fences. Lanterns along the main paths glowed with a warm yellow light, creating quiet islands of brightness against the deepening blue of the winter night. Inside the dining hall, the final trays had been arranged and the cooks prepared the simple evening meal, while soldiers and prisoners moved calmly through the familiar routine that had begun to define life inside the camp. Margaret stepped outside after finishing her tasks in the kitchen, pausing for a moment in the cool air as she looked across the yard. The heavy jacket still rested around her shoulders, its warmth now feeling almost natural after the long day. When she first arrived, the camp had seemed like a place filled with uncertainty, yet the steady rhythm of small actions throughout the day had slowly changed that impression. Boots crunched softly across the snow as prisoners walked toward their barracks. Soldiers spoke in quiet voices as they checked the lanterns and gates before the night watch began. The entire place carried a calm sense of order that felt far removed from the chaos that had shaped the world beyond the fences. Margaret walked slowly along the path toward the barracks where the other women were already gathering for the evening. As she passed beneath one of the lanterns, she noticed a familiar figure standing a short distance away near the main yard. Major James Whitaker was speaking with another officer, the soft light reflecting against the snow around them. After a moment, the other officer turned and walked toward the far building, leaving Whitaker standing alone beside the path. For a brief moment his eyes lifted and met Margaret's as she approached. There was no surprise in his expression, only the calm recognition she had come to understand. He gave a small nod, the same quiet gesture that had marked every moment they had crossed paths. Since the first day, Margaret paused for a second and returned the gesture, her hands resting inside the warm sleeves of the jacket he had given her. No words were needed between them. The silence carried its own meaning. After a moment, Whitaker turned and continued along the path toward the outer gate where the night watch would soon begin. Margaret watched him walk beneath the lantern light until his figure disappeared into the deeper shadows beyond the yard. Then she continued toward the barracks where the soft glow of another lantern shone through the frosted window. Inside, the women were settling onto their bunks, their quiet conversations blending with the faint crackle of the stove that warmed the room. Margaret removed her boots and sat on the lower bunk, pulling the heavy jacket closer around her shoulders as she listened to the calm sounds of the camp outside. The day had begun with uncertainty and cold, yet it had ended with something she had not expected to find inside a place meant for prisoners. A single act of kindness had shifted the way she looked at the people beyond the uniform, and perhaps even the way they looked at her. In the stillness of the barracks, as the lantern light flickered gently against the wooden walls and the camp settled into the quiet rhythm of night, Margaret understood something simple and lasting. Dignity did not belong to one side of a war or the other. It lived in the quiet choices people made when no one demanded it from them. And sometimes the smallest gesture, offered without hesitation in the middle of a cold winter day, could remind two strangers that humanity had not disappeared from the world after all.